Everyone, is that we're going right on the dot? We are recording this session, as we've recorded all the sessions before. So if anyone has a problem with that, please let us know, or change your name, or turn your camera off, or whatever you need to do. That's absolutely fine. So I'm just going to tell us a little bit about introduce people's land policy, just for a few minutes. I'm sorry if you've been to another seminar and you've already heard this, but I won't take long. So I just want to set the context for this seminar. So on your screen, you can see a quote from Gerald Winstanley, who's, I think, someone that I certainly hope that we are one of the, he's part of our heritage in the UK and has following in his footsteps and hopefully carrying on his the fight that he started, or the struggle, I should say, is better. Can you change the screen, please? Because I have no camera, David's having to do this the presentation for me. So we're doing the People's Land Policy sees our project as land reform from the ground up. So land is a huge issue, and it's about who owns it, who controls it, who has access to it, who makes the decision about what happens on it. All these issues underline our relationship to land. And we're, sorry, I'm just letting people in as well. Land also unites many of the issues that we're already struggling with. So if you're in housing, or if you're in environment, climate change, food, recreation, saving your community center, what connects all these issues is land. And we came, change the screen, please. So we formed after a conference called Land for What, which united a lot of different people and different struggles across London and brought them all together under this heading of Land for What. And from this, we formed the People's Land Policy and started to bring people together to find out about ideas about land and how we could change our relationship to it. What were the issues that affect people, and wanted to build a broad-based movement that could change where we are now to a more just system. Change the screen, please. So our vision in the People's Land Policy is threefold. So to see land as an ecosystem, to see that decisions should be made about it, not just on the basis of housing or on the basis of food, but take into consideration the complex relationships between social and natural processes. And the other important aspect about land is to see it as a commons. That is a source of wealth, as Gerald Winstanley said, a common treasury for all that belongs to no one really, but is and has to be stewarded by us now, long into the future, and protected and managed. And the third part of the People's Land Policy is that in order to put the first two into practice, we need to envisage a different type of democracy, a more participatory democracy, a more inclusive democracy. Please change the slide. So in order to think about all these issues, we've been talking to as many people as possible, gathering ideas and developing the documents, and trying to pull out policies that would help change and move our relationship to land, to a more equitable and just direction. And we see this as also including possibly a Land Reform Act. Change the... So we, over lockdown, one of the ideas that we came up with was a seminar series where we could find out more about and develop ourselves and help other people to learn more about land issues and what people are doing all over and what people are thinking. and discuss what needs to be done and come up with policy ideas. So we'll really encourage anyone who's interested to come to get involved or just send us your thoughts. I will put in the chat a link to the People's Land Policy, which you can download, or we can even send you a paper copy if you like, if you get in touch. I'm happy to do that. So we want as many people as possible to cast their eyes on it and to give us their ideas about it. And in this seminar series, we've actually had two. Could you change the what do you call it? The screen, thank you. We've had two series before this. First series was about land and the environment, and the second was about land and food. And this third series is about land and decision making. And 2 weeks ago, we had a seminar about participatory democracy in theory and practice. And tonight, we're going to look at it in practice in the UK. Change the slide, please. And we have 5 speakers, and I'm going to hand you over to Richard, who will explain a bit about each speaker. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Leslie. I'm Richard Lee from a London community network called Just Space. I'm afraid I'm not really going to describe each speaker, because I think you can all do that very well yourselves. But what I'd like to do is to say something about the activity of Just Space in terms of both challenging the way in which land use decisions are taken, but also, very importantly for today, the very processes and practices of participation that are important to us. And really to knit that together with the speakers that are going to follow. But at least I'm going to try and do that. So we do have speakers that are going to follow on the subject of how, as community organisations, we make decisions. We have a speaker around the community making its own plan, and then how we use our own plan. We have a speaker around the community taking control of land, taking the ownership of land and managing it. And we have a speaker around how we actually make decisions at a wider level, how we want those decisions to be taken so that we can control budgets and things like that. So I'm hoping that that what I say about Just Space can be a bit of also a signpost into the speakers that are going to follow. So with Just Space, I am talking about a London context, but I hope it will be felt to be relevant to people from other parts of the UK, other parts of the world, who are listening and participating today. So Just Space was set up to influence how decisions are taken about land use in London. And this is otherwise known as planning, how decisions are taken about the use of land. And we organised at a citywide level in order to challenge the domination of the decision making by developer interests and by public bodies. And in our view, the public bodies are very often quite close to property interests themselves. And we were facing a situation in which community voices were almost entirely excluded and marginalised. So we came together to do something about that. And we were particularly interested at the policy level, so to seek to influence what the actual policies say in our city about how land should be used. Our analysis is that the way decisions are taken about land at the moment, aka the planning system, that this is extractive. That the name of the game really is to enable developers and public bodies to extract the highest value from land. And that's leaving many of us impoverished. And we feel this is not, of course, just a London story. In fact, it's an international story. And there's much discussion at the moment around at COP26 about the extractivism towards the global south. And I think it's important that we recognise and name the extractivism within our own communities, so that we can make that link between the local and the global. So for most people, and that includes most activists, this planning system is extremely bureaucratic, very difficult to engage with. We usually will come across something called a planning application for development, and in theory, that planning application has to be consistent with policies, but these policies operate at a local authority level, a local plan, at a citywide, or especially at metropolitan areas where there will be a metropolitan-wide plan, and then national planning policy framework. So that's very complicated as it is. But then we, of course, find that in the English system of decision making, these policies are not binding. The system is based on trade-offs between policies and between financial interests. We then find that though the system requires something called a statement of community involvement for the involvement of people in planning, in actual fact, this is not very well known at all, and it's not usually followed in practice. And we end up with scenarios where many of us object to a particular development, and we pitch up before the local council only to find that all of us have to share 3 minutes of time in order to make our case. So this is why we object to the way decision making on planning and land use operates at the moment. What does Just Space do about it in terms of our participatory practice? We've spent a lot of time challenging the plans of others on these issues, but we eventually came to the position that we must produce our own plans. We must produce community-led plans, because too often we're restricted in what we're actually able to say when we're responding to someone else's plan. And if all we can do is oppose development proposals so that we're categorized as NIMBYs or as people who are not well informed, then we're always reactive, we're always in a weaker position. And so we believe strongly in communities producing their own plan. We've drawn inspiration from examples of London from the past at King's Cross, Royal Docks, and other places who have produced their own community plan. We took inspiration from the Localism Act, which gave, in theory, legal rights to produce neighbourhood plans. And in 2016, we produced a community-led plan for London. And this is not a set of bullet points. It's not like a party political manifesto. It's something quite detailed and thorough, and it's really embedded in the views of different community organisations and voices. And we're now producing at the moment a community-led recovery plan, which we hope to launch early in 2022. Secondly, within the community-led plan, we have policies on issues like how you make decisions about the development of the area you live in. And we demanded as a policy that there should be resident ballots. And this was an issue where we've had some success in that what's called estate regeneration in London. The Mayor of London agreed to bring in a policy of resident ballots before any demolition programmes can proceed. We also have policies around community ownership, whether this is ownership around housing, like housing co-ops, community land trusts. We think this really needs to be scaled up, and we support initiatives in this area, but also community ownership of other assets like community centres, transferring of public land and public buildings into community ownership. This features quite strongly in our plan as well. And then finally, in terms of the actual processes we use, which I hope is going to introduce nicely, Matthew, to what you're going to say next, is that we give great importance to consensus in what we do. We're not just looking to find out where the majority view is. We think that actually respecting minority views is all part of respecting everyone's needs. And so we use a method of consensus decision making. And really tied to that is my final point. And that is that in our challenge to a system of decision making about land use, it is very hierarchical and exclusive, and in which just a few make the decisions. We feel it's important that we don't just put forward an alternative plan, but that we also practice alternative processes for how decisions are taken. And we feel it's essential that how we go about things actually does embrace horizontal and deep participation, and puts citizens really at the centre of everything. So that's just a little bit of introduction to where we're coming from in Just Space. And if I can hand over to Matthew, I think you're going to take this subject area a bit further.
Thanks, folks. I'm having a little bit of a problem with my, so if it drops off, I will try and keep it back, but it is on and off. Okay, folks, I don't know if this is going to be any better. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. Let's hope it stays stable then. Rather than have to go through the process of making me co-host and sharing the screen, are you all looking at the slides? Can you all see those slides?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, there's quite a few people looking at them. So you've probably read them. I put in a little quick quiz there, which hopefully you've been through by now. So the first question was around historically who used consensus-like decision making. And the answer was one of those trick questions, all of those groups. So the crews on pirate ships, the Quakers, the indigenous Aymara people of Bolivia, and plenty of other indigenous peoples. The Hanseatic League, which was a Northern European trading bloc, and then radical alternatives, radical protest groups, including people like Food Not Bombs, Movement for a New Society, and so on. Second question I asked was, what is consensus? What's it described as? We all agree, a large majority of us agree, we all consent even if we don't agree, and a large majority of us consent even if we don't agree. Well, the answer was C. It's all about consent with consensus decision making. Okay, so the next thing I want folk to do, if it's okay, is I just want us to get into the space of trying to feel consensus decision making a little bit. I've put two options up in the fourth slide. You can pick either. One is a sort of positive, one is a sort of negative, and we don't all have to do the same. But what I'd like you to do is to decide whether you want to think of a time at which you felt fully included in a decision-making process, or a time at which you felt fully excluded from a decision-making process. And the way I'd like you to do this is, you can close your eyes if you like. Sometimes some people feel the help. I want you to revisit that moment. I don't want you to go in a traumatic. If being excluded from a group was a traumatic experience for you, find another example or think of a positive time. But I'd like you just to recall with all of your senses a time when you were either fully included or fully excluded from a group. You may have many examples going through your head. Find one and stick with it. I just want you to remember the situation you're in. I want you to remember the space you're in, whether it was indoors or outdoors. I want you to remember the sounds you could hear. Maybe it's other people's voices. Maybe it was traffic going by. Maybe it was birds singing. It could have been all kinds of things. People in a different room, the ballet class going on in the upstairs room of the community centre you were in, whatever it might have been. And you might want to remember what you could see, even what you could smell in the room. Maybe someone was brewing some coffee, you know. But most importantly, I want you to think about what it felt like at that moment of feeling either fully included or fully excluded from a decision-making process. And just stay with that for 5, 10, 15 seconds. Okay, and what I'd like now is just to invite you to say some of that. Just give me a few short phrases or words. What does it feel like to be included or excluded? Let's start with included. Does anyone think about inclusion? Or were you all going on the negative side of things?
No.
Okay, so let's hear some of the inclusion stuff. What did it feel like to realize that you were
To be understood.
To be in a possibility of including others. That was very important. Once you're included on a certain level, you got the power to include others, and that is why you try to get to that level so that you can do that.
anything else? Being part of something, having people ask for your opinion, valuing it, how to include others, connection, belonging.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about the exclusion side of things? What did it feel like to be outside of the group, the community, the system that was making a decision?
Frustrating.
Okay. Unfair, angry, silence, lonely, frustrating and angry. So not just frustrating, beyond frustration. Unjust, barriers, not valued. Kariana, barriers, can you give us a little bit more, either in words or in the chat? What kind of barriers? I'm just saying disregarded. These are pretty strong feelings, some of these. Loneliness, unjust, not valued, disregarded, angry, silenced. Kariana's just adding that you cannot participate in finding solutions to enable change. Yeah, you can see where some of that frustration must come from. You've got, you know, we're change makers. That's why we're here. You know? So these are really common feelings in groups and communities, and some of the work we do at Rhizome, a lot of the work we do at Rhizome is helping people work together more effectively so that these barriers can be lifted. And one of the key things that enables that is a lot of what Richard was talking about, you know, just fostering cultures of participation. And often we're coming together to do things, and doing things requires decision making. So we look for consensual methods of decision making. But consensual methods of decision making, as I suggested in the slides, is not about unanimity, because unanimity is very hard to find. But it is about creating a mindset in which we can work together and we can consent, even though sometimes we don't agree. We can put our own opinions to one side and work for what's best for the community, or what's best for the group that we're working with, what's best for the issue, what's best for the planet. Depends on exactly what we're working with. In the 6th slide, there's a picture. Thank you, David. There's a picture of a model of participatory decision making, which I find to be really useful. I find it stimulates questions. And this is from a group of US facilitators called Community at Work. And there's a book called Facilitator's Guide to Participatory Decision Making, in which they sort of explain this model. But I just want to talk really quickly through it. I've only got a few minutes, and I find it's useful to think about in terms of the practice of consensus decision making. It's all very well to say, participation, but what does it mean in practice? On the left-hand side, you've got a new topic, the start of an agenda item for a meeting, or maybe the whole of the meeting. And there's this little diamond that gets referred to as business as usual. And business as usual is, unsurprisingly, the way that most meetings are conducted, most communities operate. And in that space, you will hear the usual suspects expressing the usual opinions and coming to the kind of outcomes that, frankly, are normal, usual. Probably nothing too radical, probably nothing that rocks the status quo too much, and certainly nothing that allows some of the more divergent voices in any group to be heard, whether that's divergent because of the way they think and the ideas they have and the new reality they're trying to create, or whether it's divergent because of all of those things like race, sexuality, mental health, physical health, age, gender, etc. So in consensus, one of the things we're trying to do is hold open the space to allow in divergence, new perspectives. And that means we've got to create spaces in which it's safe for those people with those divergent perspectives to actually feel able to participate. And that's quite a big ask. How do we create a space in which people can contribute and are welcome to contribute? And it's not enough just to say, please contribute, because if you don't feel safe, that's not an opportunity you can take up. So there's a lot of work to do when we're trying to build consensus. And in this model, the Community at Work folk talk about eventually hitting this space in the middle, this jagged space that they call the grown zone. One of my colleagues likes to call it the growing zone, which is perhaps a more land-based analogy, and also represents the creativity that you can find in the struggle here. The growing zone is the bit where you've got all of this divergence going on, but how do you make sense of it? Where do you go with it? Maybe you begin to think you're starting to converge around an idea, and then someone contributes something new that throws everything into disarray. And that can feel very frustrating, and it can feel very difficult. And some groups will run back to business as usual at that stage. And they would rather make a business as usual discussion and stick with the difficulty of being genuinely open to divergence and diversity and full participation. But if you can stick with it and you can navigate your way through the growing zone, then we can begin to converge, and we can begin to synthesize the thoughts, the ideas, the perspectives into coherent ways forwards until we get to closure, until we get to make a decision. And that's a really lovely space if you've ever actually managed to get there. Some groups never do. And that's fine. Some groups get stuck in business as usual. Some groups get stuck in the groan zone. They become historically, every meeting is just conflict. It's just they lurch from conflict to conflict to conflict, because the groan zone is a space in which there is a lot of conflict often. Those diverse opinions can create stresses and tensions between us. But in that conflict is where the really good stuff happens. So the practice of consensus requires us to be able to avoid business as usual, open the space to divergence, for diversity, to get into the groan zone, maybe consciously choose to dive in there and to work with that diversity and learn to tolerate it and even learn to enjoy it, and then move through it until the individual threads that we find in the groan zone can be woven together into a more coherent tapestry that is our convergence and our outcome. And it's worth noting that the final outcome doesn't have to be one thing. It can be a number of different things. You know, a proposal that we consent to, and remember, we're consenting, not necessarily agreeing. I can consent to something that I don't think is the best idea, but I realize is where the energy of a community is, or you know, where a lot of other intelligent people seem to think the best way forwards is. Then that can be a number of different strategies, a number of different ways forwards. We can agree to do a suite of options. But this stuff isn't easy. And one of the things I want to say about consensus decision making is it is utopian. It is aspirational. And some groups will take years before they get to the point at which they feel like they're doing consensus well. And it's a journey that requires us to reflect on ourselves and our behavior in groups, and as a whole group to reflect on our place in society and to practice. And it requires good facilitation. So if consensus feels like a struggle, well, maybe it is. Get some facilitation from the outside if you need to. Get some training on how to facilitate, on how to do consensus. It's not what we're used to. We're probably on this call in this seminar because we believe in cooperation and those kind of values. But we live in a very competitive capitalist society that teaches us from the word go to have our own individualistic opinions and to compete with each other and to look for our individual fame and fortune. So consensus, you know, can be really, really difficult stuff. And I just want to finish off. Slide number 7 is, I won't worry about it right now, but just to summarize, at its best, consensus unites us rather than divides us. It demands but also supports participation, especially from the margins of the group or of society. And the thing that a lot of people don't understand about consensus is it can be very flexible. We can use consensus the way that we want to. We can consent to whatever processes work for us. So we can make a consensus process that fits to us, rather than us having to fit into a set consensus process. And it is consent, not agreement. So I might not agree, but I can live with that. That's your kind of bottom line. Hopefully it's more than that. Hopefully it leaves you feeling uplifted. There's lots of other models of consensus that are being used out there right now. There's a model from the States called consensus-oriented decision-making. There's a model that some groups use called the N Street method, which puts more emphasis on anybody that objects to a proposal to convene meetings to discuss that objection. There's consensus -1, where the group can choose to disallow an objection that's coming from just one person. There's a method called sociocracy, which is a kind of consensus light model. It's got a lot going for it. It's not as aspirational. And then there's a really good method, which I can see being used in kind of planning conversations, called Crowdwise, which is a form of preference voting, but it encourages cooperation. And it's so much more nuanced and valuable than just the standard majority vote. And all of those are discussed on the Rhizome blog. You can click that link, it'll take you to our blog. You can put in keywords like consensus and find it all, because in a few minutes, just don't have the time to deal with all those today. And consensus is being used by many, many groups. Richard was talking about it. A lot of housing co-ops, a lot of co-housing groups, land-based groups, a lot of worker co-ops, a lot of protest groups are using consensus or models of consensus, variations of consensus. Some struggle, some don't. At its best, it's a liberatory model of decision-making. And I mean that in terms of liberation struggles, like the struggle for women's liberation, or the struggle for animal liberation, or the struggle for gay liberation, whatever it might be. Okay, I'm going to shut up. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Okay, Matthew, I think the plan is that we're going to have the speakers first.
I have to jump off the call at 8, so I've got childcare responsibilities.
Yeah, maybe people can send you some questions
Absolutely
in chat
fine.
as a compromise.
Absolutely fine.
Yeah.
I'll put an email address in the chat as well, and then.
Okay. All right, but Matthew, I'm so happy that you managed to convey this to us all. It wasn't looking good, but you made it. So thanks very much for that.
Thanks to Luka for encouraging me to rejoin.
If I could now invite Carlos from Ward's Corner to speak with us about the great innovation that they have there with their community plan and the exciting ways they've managed to make use of it. Ward's Corner's always been an active member of Just Space, and I'm very pleased to have you here, Carlos.
Thank you. To begin with, I would like to quote some words that I read a long time ago. That it says, we feel small and shorter because we are on our knees. Let's stand up and we will see that probably we are the same height or probably taller than the others. And that's a good application for the whole history of the campaign for Ward's Corner. I'm going to describe how it came about. I work for a trust called Pedro Achata Trust. We were called because people was virtually ready to vacate the market, Seven Sisters, and we designed a presentation in what was the alternative. In other words, how could save the market and save the building and improve the conditions of everybody, including the building. The team that went there was an architect, a social worker, a psychologist, an accountant, and myself. I am a civil engineer, but I work as a business consultant, a community development consultant as well. So that was the basis of the first meeting, where we informed people about what was the alternative. And the alternative presented to them was to not only technical issues, but about planning and development but also dreaming, because they thought that it was a dream. But we said, if you dream enough, it will become a reality. So at the end of the presentation, everybody accepted the proposition of create an alternative plan. It was a very short time to do it because we want to present it ahead of the planning application of the developer. And we managed to do that in record time. But first, there were workshops where all the dreams, let's call it like that, of everybody, of the traders in the market, were expressed freely and with a facilitator. And the architect took all that information and translated into a plan that was submitted in short time to the as a planning application. But before that, it was a public presentation of that alternative plan to the whole community, and that it became the community plan, because the residents immediately also adopted or decided to adopt that plan. And one of the important things about any campaign is to identify who is the other side, because otherwise you don't address the most important issues. In this particular case, in Tottenham, it was the council, not the developer. And they have at that time a different concept for development. It was to go into private enterprises without consultation, of course. So the council wanted to become a business, practically. That was the theory of them. That was completely in opposition of the community plan. So it took us a lot of interviews with the whole community. It took 6 years to have a complete expression of the neighborhood, and it was approved. And that, you can see how it gained strength and strength. And at the end, I cannot extend me too long because 17 years of campaigning cannot be told in a few minutes. But the point I want to make is that the most important thing is the resilience of those that produce the community plan, not only the traders of the market, but also the residents that adopt it. And at the end, the developer withdraw because he says, according to them, minority, a noisy minority, he was being too loud, which is a ridiculous excuse for not admitting that they couldn't match our proposition. I think that is a good synopsis of of the community plan and have it was used not just on a strategy, as many thought at the beginning, but a reality. Yeah, no.
Carlos, sorry. Carlos, because you have a little time left, you've been very, very succinct. Could you say a little bit about where Seven Sisters is, a little bit about the Latin American trades and community, and then maybe a little bit about the new democratic model that you've recently established, because all that's very interesting, I think.
Well, first of all, it is not recently started. It was from the beginning.
Okay.
And why? Because in Latin America, it's very common to have that participatory model. Not exactly the same, but similar. It's a concept that it comes from the indigenous people. That was very important because was an expression of our culture and translated into modern times and in another country. Doesn't mean that in the UK you don't have similar concepts, but when the Latin American market was established, already have these concepts. That's why it's very important to acknowledge that these workshops that I mentioned reflect all that spirit of them. And can you repeat the other things, the other aspects?
It was only so everyone listening understands the location. I'm not sure you said where your location is.
Okay. Seven Sisters is the name of the underground station in the Victoria Line, and the Works Corner building is located on top of the exit of the underground station. It's very important because it has a different history of the industrial revolution and how they became from having a small workshop as carpenters to a department store in the area of Tottenham, who also has a long history in commerce, traditional markets, and is very rich also in new ideas. So Tottenham is famous, unfortunately, not for these positive things, but for not necessarily negatives, but the reaction of people to frustration of being neglected.
Okay, Carlos, you are very precise, and thank you very much. And I think there'll be some questions for you when everyone's completed. So thank you, Carlos. Angela, would you like to tell the story of Langholm around the community buying land and managing it and so on?
Yeah, that's fine, Richard. Thank you very much. Oh, thanks, David. Do you want to just do it from the? Yeah, that's lovely. Yeah, if you could just go back one, go back to the cover slide. Thanks. So, hello everybody, my name's Angela Williams and I'm the Development Manager with the Langholm Initiative, based in South Scotland in Dumfries and Galloway. I have to say at the start, I'm still relatively new to this position in terms of Langholm. Only myself and Jenny, who's the estate manager, who couldn't make it tonight. We've only been there 3 or 4 months, so we've still got a lot of learning to do, both as to what's happened in the past and in terms of working out ways of working in the future. As an individual, I do have a background in community land ownership in Scotland. For the last sort of 18 years or so, I've been based up in the Highlands, largely on Knoydart for about 16 years and a couple of years in Fort Augustus. So I've seen different communities at work with regard to land ownership. Okay, next slide, David. Thanks. So just sort of the 3 areas that I'll try and cover today. I'm just going to give a very, very brief welcome to Langholm, a very brief synopsis of us as a town. I'm then going to talk about community involvement over the last 18 months, but more importantly, talking about the future, about the community involvement and community decision making as we actually start to move forward as a community landowner. So next slide. So a little bit about Langholm. We're in Dumfries and Galloway. We're on the A7. We're a small town surrounded very much by some lovely countryside. We have a population of about 2,000 people. It's a little bit of an ageing population, along with many sort of similar towns. We do have that issue of a lot of young people who go away after finishing school don't always come back. The Langholm Initiative itself is a development trust. We're about 25 years old, so we're one of South of Scotland's longest standing community development trusts. But we're also now one of the biggest community landowners in the South of Scotland. Not in Scotland itself, there are many bigger ones up in the Highlands and in the Outer Isles in Harris and Lewis and such like. Langholm itself has very, very strong cultural connections with the land. The background of this photo, you can see the common riding. And this is a tradition of many towns in the borders where traditionally it's about marking out areas of kind of where the people had the right to use land. It's marking out the boundaries. And that's now developed over the years into a sort of very strong, at one level, tourist attraction, but also at another level, it's sort of quite fundamental about the community marking out the land that they have access to. Langholm was traditionally a mill town, but the traditional textile industries, just like similar towns throughout the UK, have collapsed. So it's now very much a sort of niche industry. We do have a very small number of firms employing a small number of people, often on a sort of with big clients like Victoria Beckham, like Chanel, the big names, but very, very much a niche industry now. So the chance to actually buy land that surrounded the town was seen very much as an opportunity to start regenerating the town, rebuilding it, and looking at a new sort of more nature-based economy. So that's just very much the context to where we are today. So the next slide. So just to give a little bit of background, because as of March of this year, the community became the owner of 5,200 acres of land and 6 properties. The background to that was Back in 2019, the Buccleuch estate, which is one of the biggest landowners in the UK, owned by the Duke of Buccleuch, put up Langholm Moor for sale. Langholm Moor in total is about 25,000 acres, stretching from Langholm over into the borders. It's a huge area. For the community in Langholm, this was a huge issue, and there was immediate uproar about it when it was headlined in the local paper, because there was such a strong connection with the land, and there was the fear as to what was going to happen to the land if a third party came in and bought it. The Langholm Initiative very quickly organised itself to speak to the local community to get a view as to should it take forward a community buyout of the land, or in this case, it wouldn't be a registering a right to buy, it would actually be negotiating with the seller, with the Duke of Buccleuch. A group of volunteers very quickly went out, spoke to local people in the town. In a matter of days, I think we got about half the local population signing a petition supporting the Langholm Initiative taking forward purchase of the land. A local volunteer working group was set up. There was support from the board members who are all volunteers themselves of the Langholm Initiative. And alongside that was a lot of volunteer support to do a lot of the back-breaking work involved at this stage. There was a timeline imperative on it, but Buccleuch estates were supportive of the principle and were willing to give the community a chance to see if it could actually put together a financial plan, undertake all the work necessary for a business plan, feasibility study to see if it could take forward a buyout. The Langholm Initiative was only interested in around 10,500 acres that was in the Dumfries and Galloway area, and that was kind of associated with Langholm. But the price tag on that 10,000 acres, 10,500 acres, was 6.4 million. The drive behind this was to protect the land, to establish it as a nature reserve, but it was also to drive forward economic opportunities as well. So over a 6-month period, feasibility study was undertaken, funding was sought to bring in a consultant to undertake business plan, consultant to undertake valuations. All this was undertaken with volunteer support and with some funding that was allowed the Langholm Initiative to pay an employee to help with this. And I think it's key to say that there was 2 or 3 individuals who were absolutely key in driving forward this and working with the local community to keep their support and make the whole thing viable. And I wasn't there at the time, although interestingly, I was watching it from a distance because it was such a big ask. And I think key to the end success was that whole issue about keeping the community engaged and informed. At this point, it wasn't so much consultation. It had got a clear directive as to, yes, we want you to buy the land. And so the working group and the volunteers focused very much on all the background work to make it viable, but also in keeping the community updated as to where they were at in the process, and where support was needed. With such a big price tag, there was a huge amount of effort into securing the funding. As it turned out, for a number of reasons, mainly the grant deadlines put on one of the funders, the Scottish Land Fund, as a community, we ended up paying 3.8 million to purchase 5,200 acres. So it was about half of what we originally wanted. That took place in March of this year. And since then, we've got a staff team put in place. And we've now actually started a process to go back and finish what we started and buy the remaining 5,300 acres. So if you can move to the next slide. But in a way, I'm not saying that the buyout was easy, but I think it's fair to say there was a huge amount of goodwill, of community support, of interest from literally all around the world. We had people donating from every single corner of the world, including some very, very big donations as well. And I think that there's, you know, keeping that ball rolling, it was really exciting. There was, as I say, huge amount of community support, huge amount of media involvement. The spotlight was constantly on Langholm. But I think if you speak to many communities who've gone through the buyout process, suddenly you then become a community landowner. We're not just a community landowner, we're a landlord. We're a land manager, we own buildings. And suddenly you're having to deal with the mundane, the sort of day-to-day issues of what happens when somebody's water pipe bursts, what happens when part of your track runs away. So we're in this interesting situation where at the moment, as an organisation, we're trying to establish the Taris Valley Nature Reserve. We've got a very new staff team. We're not all local, so we are treading a little bit carefully. There are a lot of issues where we know there are very, very strong local views. So we have a lot of engaging to do and we have a lot of listening to do. So at the one hand, we're proceeding with the second buyout. And I think it's fair to say that it's not the same level of momentum as there was first time round. And we knew that was going to be the case. We knew this was going to be a big ask. But we've got that going on as one strand. We also have the issues of being a landlord, of being a property owner. We have to keep on top of all those day-to-day sort of a little bit tedious, a little bit boring, but really important for our tenants, of making sure that the buildings are looked after and that we have the water tested or the septic tanks emptied or whatever it might be. But the big issue is that we need to develop a land management plan. And certainly when the staff team came on board, we very quickly realised that while during the buyout, there was a lot of strong messages as to how the land would be used. Suddenly becoming the landowner, that we needed to maybe take a little bit of a step back and just go back and listen and talk to people. In some cases, that's interest groups. In some cases, that's just to individuals. Almost to sort of like make sure that we've still got the mandate for moving ahead with what we said at the time of a buyout. So the messages at the buyout were about ecological restoration of the land. It was around about some new woodland planting. There is a small area of felling to take place. All these you might think are relatively straightforward, but within that there's a lot of strong concerns. The area is a triple SI and SPA because we've got hen harriers in the area. We've also got a large number of other birds of prey as well. And so there's very strong concerns or views about what happens to these birds if we plant the area. Richard, I've just picked up on your message. I'll talk about that in a second. So we've had to do an awful lot of engagement and we're still feeling our way with this. So we're using everything from social media, traditional media, We're establishing volunteer groups. We're doing a lot of face-to-face drop-in sessions. Besides being in the office, we're making sure we're in the town, in the local tourist information office an afternoon a week. We're trying to listen and we're trying to communicate and trying to make sure that we're sort of setting down values as to how we are going to operate. If I can come back to Richard's point about trustees, the Langholm Initiative, as I say, has been going for 25 years now. So anybody who's a member of the Langholm Initiative can stand as a director, as a trustee. So we have on the board, I think it's 9 or 10 trustees. But what we have also done is, because this is such a big project, we've established an executive committee, and we asked for people who were interested, asked and also targeted a couple of individuals to come onto that committee to help deal with the day-to-day management. And we're also going to be setting up advisory groups to act as sort of experts, as a sort of expert panel that we can go to for advice about land management issues. But we also make sure that there is constant going back to our community about decisions that are being taken. And in some cases, there will be wider discussions about specific decision making. In some cases, on day-to-day stuff, that will be taking place within the office and running it past directors. So as I say, we're still very much learning. We're still learning as we go. We're learning how our community works, how they want us to come back on decision making, how the community wants to be involved. So we are taking tiny steps in the direction at the moment. And hopefully, if I speak again to you in a year's time, we'll have a very different, we'll have a clearer view as to how we are moving forward on that whole issue around involvement and decision making. So I think that's it.
Yes.
I think.
Angela, thank you very much. It's this is a very different example for many of us here,
Yes,
and
I appreciate
it's very
that.
exciting. It's exciting to hear about the scale of what you're doing, and well done on getting there this year. Could I finally invite Luka, our final speaker? We say in the draft of our People's Land Policy that we would like to see the use of participatory budgeting in an ambitious way. And I'd like to invite Luka to share his research on different examples of participatory budgeting.
Yes, David, could you share the slides, or should I just share my screen?
If you could do that, Luka, that would be brilliant. Yeah.
To share my screen, yeah. How do I do that? Because I don't usually use Zoom. Usually use a university system.
At the bottom of it should be at the bottom of your screen. It says share screen.
Oh yeah.
There's a green button there. Yeah.
Okay. Can you see my slide?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak here today. It's really a pleasure to be here in this virtually. I'll be talking about participatory budgeting. I mean, first of all, my name is Luka, and I'm a master's student at the University of Westminster, currently studying international planning and sustainable development. It's really urban planning with a focus on sustainability and also on developing countries. And so participatory budgeting, or PB as I'll refer to it most of the time, is really a passion of mine. I mean, I really believe in a participatory form of democracy and really being able to empower our communities. And I think this can really be a process that allows that. So during my undergraduate studies, my dissertation focused on PB and nature-based solutions in Lisbon, in Portugal. So I actually went there, did some interviews, met with a researcher and the participation division of the city, and with someone from a local authority. And I learned a great deal actually about how these processes work. And just, you know, I'll make the presentation available later on, because there's quite a lot of links and some useful information, I hope, in there to be looked at. So I think the key thing to look at is really international best practice. But first, of course, I want to explain what PB actually is. So it is a democratic process where citizens are able to vote, to make proposals and vote on how the municipal budgets are spent in their communities, or how do we meet our priorities is really the key. And as a basis for this presentation, I've looked at a report by Shared Futures, which is a UK-based so-called community interest company that promotes community empowerment, social economy, and participatory democracy. So they have a report called Mainstreaming Participatory Budgeting, which is focused on the UK and how we can really make a meaningful PB happen across the UK. But yeah, to start off with, I'll just read a definition that Shared Futures gives for PB. So they describe it as to address inequalities in service provision and resource allocation, engage and empower citizens in discussions on public budgets, and stimulating co-production, mutual responsibility between citizens and the state. So I think this is really a meaningful explanation, because it is really about empowering people, and it can be something radical that really allows meaningful decisions over meaningful budgets, and that's the key message here. And to start off, I'd like to talk just briefly about the origins of PB, which is in Brazil, in the city of Porto Alegre, in the 1980s. It is a useful starting point because at the time it was a very radical idea. It came from the Workers' Party in Brazil and was implemented in a few cities, and first in Porto Alegre. And there were some really meaningful outcomes, like there was improved investment in infrastructure, housing, and education. And it really led to a stronger political understanding for people who never were involved in politics before. So there's this story that really stood out to me from a book called The Cities of the Global South, Reader. It's the story about a construction worker called Marco, who had never been involved in politics before, but through the delegate system of PB was chosen to further develop proposals, and he became a key figure in his community, and actually went on to start a housing co-op in the informal settlement where he was living. So Shared Futures gives a recommendation based on Porto Alegre for the structure of a PB process. I'll just read that out briefly, and you can see it here. It's the first phase is the allocation of budgets, and then community members can identify priorities. This is a very open phase where you have a workshop or an assembly where people can come together and from the community with no exclusion. And then from that phase, once proposals are drafted, delegates are drawn through a lottery system. And this is just how it was done in Porto Alegre. There are different versions of this, but it is a good example. And then the fourth phase is it goes to open voting, which is either can be digital or through public assembly. And then the key thing is that these decisions need to be binding afterwards, and that officials recognize the winning proposals and actually initiate the implementation. And then these delegates that were chosen from the community have a role as to monitor how these projects are taken forward, if they're really so they ensure accountability on the part of the local authorities. So there are some things here to look at in terms of the UK, which is the focus of this seminar. I just came up with some key aims and looked at the potential of PB in the UK, it definitely is a challenge to think about how to achieve this here. I mean, it has been done, but there is a strong top-down bias on the part of local authorities and the government. So it's something we really need to overcome. And at the moment, it really consists, PB, when it exists, really is done through small grant making. It isn't really, so often in PB and international practice, when it's used as a good governance excuse, I would say sometimes it's at least 1% of budgets are allocated for PB. But in the UK, this isn't even the case. They're actually just small grants that I don't think deliver the outcomes the more radical land reform outcomes I think we all are thinking about. And there are good international best practice examples. I think looking at the Brazilian example and also the one in Portugal and others more nearby in Paris, which I'll come back to. I believe we really need to focus on campaigning for PB to make it mainstream and lobby the government. We need a political change to achieve this. We need to negotiate with local governments, but really make a convincing case for PB and try to get what we want, really. So yeah, PB can really increase outcomes for equity in the provision of public services and makes things more efficient as our needs are better understood, the community's needs are better understood. I think we should aim to avoid exclusion of existing means of citizen participation and civil society. So including, say, if we have a delegate process, to include delegates from associations, tenants associations, neighborhood forums. Yeah, I was reading an article about this where they mentioned the dangers of where PB can be used as an excuse to actually exclude these kinds of existing means of participation. That's really something we want to avoid. If we want to have a meaningful PB, then we really need to be inclusive. And so there are some existing networks in the UK. There's the UK PB network and PB Scotland. I just have a quote from both that explains what they do. But their structure is, so the PB network is a voluntary advisory group, and PB Scotland is mostly funded by the Scottish government. And the UK PB network says they aim to address inequalities in service provision and resources, allocation, engaging and empowering citizens in discussions on public budgets, stimulating co-production and mutual responsibility between citizens and the state. And PB Scotland is really a hub for Scotland, sharing and learning about what they say is the great work being done by PB initiatives. Yeah, and this is just their platform to make profiles of good examples of PB. So how do we meet the priorities of our communities? I have here two examples. I was looking for UK examples that had the meaningful outcomes we would really strive for, which was quite difficult, especially to find an example in England. I did find that in 2006 there was an open budget by Harrow Council. What was interesting about it is that the entire budget was made available. The entire municipal budget was made available for public deliberation and voting. However, there you have to ask, what are the constraints? What are the other constraints that were in place? For example, maybe they had only key areas that people could decide on. And also, I was looking at resource. There's this really good resource about PB, which is called Participedia.net, where you find examples from all over the world, including UK examples of participatory budgeting. Yeah, there I only found a few bullet points on the outcomes of the process, which I guess really the main positive outcome was that it increased understanding of local governments, what they say, and that it developed a framework for engagement, and that people were able to understand the strategic options. That's what they say. This, at least it definitely increased understanding of budgets and the council's work. So I would say probably the only thing I would promote about this is that we need to really strive for the entire budget to be made available for PB. I think that is a radical claim. And in this case, also accountability was guaranteed through a monitoring panel of delegates, which is also always, I think, something to look for. Accountability is really key. Unfortunately, this PB in Harrow was discontinued after the change in government and when New Labour wasn't in government anymore. And also a change in political balance at Harrow Council. So another weakness I would say is that only minor issues were addressed. I mean, they did talk about like local schools and how like choosing the teachers for local schools and environmental issues. However, I think these are still not, it's not quite as radical as we want it to be. So concluding thoughts on this example are that I really believe that political will is necessary if we want to achieve a meaningful participatory budget. And also, yeah, again, even though this is an older example, I still thought it would be worth mentioning because of the entire budget being available. But I really struggled to find examples of PB in the UK that could provide a way forward. However, our neighbor in Paris actually have a citywide PB that was introduced by the progressive mayor on the Hidalgo. And it's organized through a digital platform where any Parisian citizen can make a proposal, can bring a proposal as long as it fits in a few areas. I mean, they're very broad areas, so there's quite a lot of room for different types of proposals. So for example, there was a proposal to address the homelessness issues and create better services for especially for homeless women. I think that was an interesting project that stood out to me. And the difference here to the UK is that there was the political will, and I think that's also has to do with the structure of the government in Paris. Traditionally very top down, but with a progressive mayor was also able to make this a very like a citywide example. And there's a strong emphasis on digital participation, which also can have its downsides, can be exclusive if people aren't. So I think you really need a combination of digital and in-person assemblies. So that's pretty much the only weakness there, except also that the budgets available were also limited still. However, already better than in the UK, I would say. So it is a meaningful example, and there's a whole article on it on Participedia, so there's a link here that you can have a look at. I just would like to give some conclusions. So through PB, the political process becomes more transparent and accountable. Citizens are given a stronger voice in decision-making, and direct democracy is strengthened. And it can build trust in institutions if decisions are binding and budgets allocated for PB are sufficient. And that is really key, the binding decisions and the size of the budget available. I also wanted to touch upon a few points that other speakers made, but first I'll just go through this. Yeah, I think achieving PB in the UK requires a big push, and we need to strengthen existing networks like the UK PB network, and it requires trying to make changes in government, easier said than done, but also through activism and just community organizing and trying to put this together. We should aim to gain access to as much of council budgets as possible if we really want to achieve our community's priorities. And my message really is we should mainstream PB. It's really a passion of mine and I think it's a key example of democratic innovation at a larger scale. If you can integrate it into our cities, our communities, our neighborhoods, I think it really can make a difference. I just want to mention also, it really can tackle these land issues. If we look at the example in Brazil, where housing co-ops were formed out of it, and there was major investment in infrastructure in areas that were neglected. I think that really countered that extractivism that Richard was talking about. And yeah, I really believe we should be radical in this and try to work towards a PB that is meaningful. That's my presentation.
Mm.
Thank you, Luka. Very much. That completes the 5 speakers. David, are you handling the next part?
How do I stop sharing? Here. Okay.
Yeah, so we've still got some time available for questions, any points of information or anything that you want to. Okay, so there's a question from Kerry Anna. Actually, why don't you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah. So, hi everyone. I was just interested in asking the question around sort of, I guess in society at the moment, we're kind of inundated with information and everybody leads sort of busy lives with sort of general day-to-day things. And also when sort of policy and also feeding back on policies and plans in local councils is sort of quite complicated. How do we get more people involved and informed about what's going on, and how do we make participation more accessible so engagement is more diverse? Because sometimes obviously with policy papers and things like that, you have to read through them and it takes a lot of time to sort of give your feedback. So like, how do we make that easier, and sort of how do we enable people to know what's going on within their communities, but it just doesn't make it so hard?
Thanks. So Carlos, do you want to give that question a go?
Please repeat it again. I was thinking about the other question. I'm sorry.
I could summarize it correct, Kariyama, but I think it was along the lines of it's. And I think Angela said about this as well. Okay. It's like
yes.
Yeah, quite a process to get involved in, quite complex, lots of policy papers. It's quite bureaucratic. It demands a lot of time. How do you go about getting more people involved in that and making the decisions that are made more representative, rather than the people who maybe might be used to that bureaucracy and that way of working?
Well, in our particular case, there were 2 factors mainly. One is that within the council, there were a lot of friendly people, officers and councillors that personally they were passing information to us and were members of the coalition. Therefore, it was a very natural way of sharing information in a more digestible way. And also, the main media to get communicated to each other was the email. We always redacted all responses and lobbying and letters and things like that in common. They just circulate to the whole network, and it was contributed by whoever wanted to add or correct or change anything. And maybe the other thing is that we had a lot of specialist membership in the coalition as well.
Okay, thanks, Carlos. Angela, do you have anything to add to that? How do you get people involved in what might be sort of like quite time-consuming and bureaucracy?
I think it's hugely difficult, and it's on a day-to-day basis. I think that there's always that risk that people get involved. Maybe they might be retired, so they have a bit more time. So the danger is you can end up with a, maybe sort of a slightly skewed view or involvement. I think when we were going through the decision-making process as to whether or not we should buy the land, from what I understand, there was a huge amount of support across the board, because it was something that an awful lot of people, I think across the age range, from the very young through to their parents, across all ages. And I think it was quite easy to get their support, because at that point, it was very much about signing the petition, maybe writing a letter, and just actually being there behind us. But a lot of the legwork was carried out by a smallish group of volunteers who were willing and able to give up their time. Now that included some people who were working, but it also included people who were retired and did have more time to maybe put in more of the legwork. And I don't know how, Kariana, how you do tackle that issue, because to be participatory, you do have to look at making sure you are trying to be representative, and that you make it as easy as possible for people to contribute. There's no magic wand. I think if you've got some paid staff time, making sure that you can go out and talk to people, so you make it as easy for them to give their views or get involved in some way, shape or form, but not every group has that luxury.
Thanks.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course you can, Jenny.
Sorry. I'm in the middle of 2/3 through a big book on land, and some of the papers are in academia, if you know that site. But I think one of the very important things is to understand where the power lies. And there are two very major things for me when you talk about contribution and involving people. The first thing is that they need to have good information, and that they understand that information, and that information is kind of worth having and is understandable. and I mean, a very simple example is that, if the government says we put 20 million in the NHS, that means absolutely nothing, because that's an input. And what we got to look at is the outcomes. So we got to force the government to say, okay, how many beds will that provide? What will you do with it? Because for all I know, that 20 million can go to consultants. So in itself, saying the government has promised 20 million means absolutely nothing. We got to force them all the time to detail what that is for, and then hold them to it. The other thing is that people get very bad information. And to me, I'm so sorry about my voice, but a democracy is based on knowledge. You got to have people who understand, who got access to information, so that they don't make decisions based on something which is woolly and not quite right. So I've always started all my life when in information and with groups, to make sure that their information is put in a way. For instance, when I was on the council, I provided a service, quote unquote, of my own bat, which translated council papers into language that everybody could understand. And that helped an awful lot, because people were more interested, because they could understand what was happening actually. So, and the second thing is to be realistic about power. And ultimately, for instance, all the land in England, in the UK, belongs to the Crown. And the government has got complete freedom to take that over. They can have compulsory purchase. So whatever you do, they can come tomorrow when you've got a brilliant project, you've built houses, and they can say, we want that site for military use, and they can take it. So we got to understand what we do and why we do it. And all that information need to be part of the decision making. And that is a very in a way, difficult thing to do, but it's also simple in the sense that we need to learn to understand how much people understand of the decisions that are being made and why and how we can influence them in a way that is accessible to people, which a lot of the council stuff isn't. I mean, just reading through a planning committee thing, you know, it's section 3, number 5. What does that mean? Absolutely nothing. And to normal people. And that puts them off because they don't understand what it is about. So to me, it's always been very important to translate all that stuff in things that people can understand very simply. And that has quite often woken people up to what is actually happening in real stuff. And then we got to see the difference because people who are providers and people who are campaigners. So there are people, I live in Brighton and we have always had a very high homeless population. And there are people who provide, and they're very, very useful and very dedicated. And they provide soup runs and, you know, they have a bus where you can sleep on, all that kind of stuff. And then there are people who actually tackle the problem from upstairs. And those two need to work together, and that's very important. So there is a whole lot of things, but if anybody is interested, those papers are on academia. I hope I've made them easy to read for everybody. That was the idea in my name. And I'd be very interested in if Luka, if I could access to what you're doing, because I'd be very interested to read what's going on there. I don't know how I could access your papers, but if somehow or other you could tell me where I can read them, I'd be very interested. But I keep saying we all got to become epistocrats, as they call it. We all got to make our people knowledgeable. And that, well, I did in some places of Brazil. I did some work with the sem terras in Brazil, the landless people, you know, and to just make sure that they were informed was a major, major thing to make the group coherent. Because information is put deliberately, I would say, quite often in a way that nobody understands what is actually going on. Lots of council papers are, if you look at it. I know I've done it for years, and I mean, I've struggled. I think there's a brilliant one, which is the definition of a forest, which is under section 325.5b, subsection 27.9, and it actually means a forest, you know. If you know that, that's fine, but you don't. And I think that kind of thing to detail, to make things accessible to people, is absolutely major in whatever we do. Otherwise, they're not interested.
Thanks, Jenny. But on that subject with Luka, you know, participating budgeting, for example, doesn't sound like something I personally, for example, would, you know, have any knowledge or skills or.
No, but we can give it to you.
Yeah,
very simply.
I'm just putting your question to Luka, whether sort of like in Porto Alegre there was some process, you know, to educate people, to, you know, to build up their knowledge and their skills to sort of like make those decisions.
I would definitely say so. I think there was facilitation involved, and it was part of administrative reforms. So there was an element of the government also promoting this and really promoting inclusiveness as well. So they really brought in people to these processes that, like I said, never had participated before. But gradually through these processes, they became more educated on how the system works, and of course they know best really what their communities need. I think that's also the key thing. And also I want to get to Jenny's question as well, that about information, or rather the point you made about information. I think that's key in participatory budgeting, and you can see that also in the examples of Portugal and Paris. So in Lisbon, they also have a citywide PB and individual ones for the different local authorities, and their websites are from the digital side, they have already quite a good way of informing people, and they don't make it inaccessible. They make it very much accessible to people who have the digital skills. And also there also are public assemblies. I think the most advanced version of PB is definitely in Europe, is in Portugal, I would say, because in Paris it's relatively newer, and it's mainly just digital. So I think that's a weakness there.
Yeah.
But there are things we can learn from other European examples, I think, in the UK.
Certainly. Yeah.
Carlos, did you want to come in as well? You've got your hand up.
Yes, I just noticed that I left some other factors in terms of the informing the community and also to encourage participation. At this moment, we are working in creating a community benefit society, which is the one that is going to be with the role of managing the rest of the project for the community plan. And one of the important factors is that we have involved a lot of volunteers from the knowledge community. Therefore, they are people that can manage the information more efficiently, and also it's easier for them to facilitate a more readable and understanding version, which is what we are beginning to do as well via a newsletter for the public, in simple words, explaining what is behind all these concepts. And in terms of making decisions as well, I think I want to address the other question about what happened with the council, how they change position. In reality, there always have been people that believe in similar concepts, like the campaign. There was a moment where the people that were trying to do opposite lose the control of the council. And it seems maybe just by chance, but it wasn't by chance. It was because more and more of the people that believe in this participation were gaining the ability or empowerment to be able to vote more clearly in favor of that sort of approach.
Brilliant.
And in the case of, sorry, just this the last bit. In the case of the Latin American community, we have also encouraged Anglo-Latin Americans, young people that have mixed background, to also to get involved in our campaign, and that was been very successful as well.
Brilliant. I think we've got time for maybe a couple more questions. I know, Leslie, you put a question in the chat. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Sue. Thank you. Yes, I wanted to ask the speakers, Carlos and Angela, I guess, and maybe Luka, whether you thought size was a factor in success. The fact that Ward's Corner was involved a smaller number of people who had a single focus, and in the same way that Langholm is a small town and was able to come together more easily. Whereas for me, it seems incredibly daunting to have something like Paris or London, you know, as a participatory project, which is much bigger and has so many more different disparate interests in it. I mean, maybe something like the council might be a smaller unit that it might be possible to put it forward. But whether you think size is a factor that will make the success more, you know, more possible or not.
So Angela, do you want to come in to answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think size is an issue. I mean, when I worked upon Noida, we had a community there of 150 people. So at one level, it was easier to get people engaged because people would be well aware of the issue, whatever the issue might be. People would understand the importance to the community that they were a part of. I think here in Langholm, yeah, obviously much bigger community, 2,000 people, but with a strong sense of tradition, and so there was that feeling of, you know, our land is under threat, or could be under threat. So that gave a momentum to it. If we were a town of 20,000 people, would we have had the same response? I suspect not. And I think, you know, you probably see it in where you may be having a community asset transfer in a big town. It's either a community of interest or an immediate community who quite often I identify with it, but that doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't try and reach out to that wider, bigger community. But I think if you are smaller, yes, it probably is easier.
No.
And Carlos, do you want to have a go at that one?
Yes, our case, as I was listening the Scottish experience, I found it very similar in many ways. The difference maybe is that it was not necessarily traditions, because the area of Tottenham, N15, is one of the most diverse in Europe. But people have found a new identity of being living in Tottenham. So that produced a sort of new concept for them. It's no longer whether they come from this ethnia or other country, it's where they live at present. That I think is very important. It's, funnily enough, a lot of the ideas and concepts that are in Tottenham are they have been inherited from different migrant groups that came from Europe, you know, escaping from the prosecution of even the humanism and others, you know, like Quakers and others like that. So the point basically is that when there are common interests and ideas, it's not so difficult to motivate people to come together and to find consensus in a natural form.
Brilliant, thanks. We're just getting up to 9 o'clock now, so I think we need to close up. Alec, are you here to do the close up?
Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm just going to do the final closing remarks. Thank you so much to all our speakers for some wonderful examples and ideas, looking at places from Scotland, Tottenham, and Michael from Matthew, sorry, from Rhizome, who unfortunately had to leave for childcare. So thank you so much for sharing all your experiences, and thank you also for everyone who's asked questions and joined us. It's been really fun and interesting. I'd just like to add that we've got our next seminar on the 22nd of November. It's you can register on Eventbrite. I'm just going to put a link to it in the chat for everybody. And for that one, we have speakers. Well, that one is all about movement building, and we have speakers from the Movimiento Buen Vivir, from Shared Assets and the London Mining Network. So I would hope to be a really exciting chat about how we sort of build solidarity and movements and energy behind the themes we've been talking about in the past two seminars, which have been all about, as we said, participatory democracy. I'll also put a link in just to our websites where you can see the People's Land Policy document that we've been working on. Obviously, everything we do in these seminars, it really feeds into it. And we want it to be a document that is very much built through dialogue. So we're always really excited and really want to encourage anybody who's interested in getting involved to please drop us a line. If you would like to come to any of our meetings or discussion, that'd be fantastic. So just to end that, it's really great to see everybody, and we hope to see you at the next seminar on the 22nd. So thanks very much, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Okay, bye.
Okay, see you soon. Bye.
Bye, everyone.